I'm in America today, and I'm going to talk to you about why I support DOGE when it comes to the financial industry, even as somebody who has been involved in both regulated and non-regulated entities. So I'm speaking from experience. I'm not just speaking from theory, and I'm also speaking from the perspective of somebody who right now is actually going through the process of buying out several regulated entities around the world. So I'm not just speaking as like a bystander or somebody who has no experience in this. I'm speaking about somebody who is actually dealing with this situation in different parts of the world. Now, before going on, I should say that just because I support DOGE in the financial industry doesn't mean that my video should be misrepresented as like, oh, he supports Trump or he supports Musk or blah, blah, blah. This is not a wider political point. I'm just speaking about DOGE from the point of view of the financial industry only. I'm not going to speak on this video about DOGE when it comes to other aspects of government, like US-centric issues like Medicare and healthcare and so on. I'm just going to speak about it from the financial industry and from a global perspective. So the first point I would make is there's a lot of what I would call corporate communism when it comes to regulation. So if you look online, there's a lot of people who say ridiculous things like, oh, if an asset class isn't regulated, it's a scam. So for example, when it came to Bitcoin years ago, many financial advisors in the regulated space would say, oh, it's a scam because it's not regulated, and all the advisors offering Bitcoin are unregulated, so it's a scam. So a lot of advisors and wealth managers and bankers, they seem to think they are superior if they've got well-regulated solutions as opposed to products that are unregulated, like Bitcoin until recently. Also things like art and wine and whiskey. In general, they are unregulated asset classes. However, in reality, a lot of well-regulated solutions don't necessarily actually help the consumer. I'll give you an example. So when I was in the financial industry back in 2013, when I first got into it, there were many offshore pensions like QROPs, Qualified Recognized Overseas Pension Schemes, and SIPs. But the vast majority of those accounts actually didn't do very well because the fees on those accounts tended to be very high. So yes, it was very well regulated, but it wasn't actually good for the consumer. People should never think that regulation means that the consumer is automatically going to get a good outcome. What is important, and I think this is very important, is transparency. Consumers do need to know, okay, with product one, your pension is highly regulated. With product two, I don't know, wine or Bitcoin or NFTs, it's unregulated or semi-regulated. It is important to have transparency, and I'm not against transparent regulations saying that you need to be transparent. So for example, when it comes to many high net worth assets, like for example, high risk private debt and loan notes and so on and so forth, often a declaration needs to be put on the application form. The same with private equity. Usually you need to say, okay, I understand the risk, blah, blah, blah. I actually support that. I think regulation is just very basic and ensures that people understand what they're getting into. That is very important. But what isn't important is saying, oh, according to section 2.10 of interpretation, blah, blah, blah. That is not important. That's just government bureaucracy, right? So I'm not saying all regulation is bad and everything needs to be completely unregulated. But the reality is regulation does not actually mean recourse. Regulation is not recourse, which kind of brings me to a second point, and that's that in general, regulation does not work well across borders. So for example, if you've got a banker or wealth manager or financial advisor who is based in, I don't know, Chile, to give you an example, in Latin America, and he or she is a British person, and they're regulated in, let's say, Malaysia or wherever it is, the reality is, as somebody who's been in the industry now for over 10 years, the idea that you can successfully claim against a financial company who is operating across different jurisdictions is for the birds. So another thing I would say is a lot of regulation and a lot of regulated firms, they do actually mislead when it comes to this. They'll say, oh, according to our license number X, Y, and Z in Labuan, Malaysia, or Panama, or whatever, we can, do this and this. That might be literally true, but if you're living, say, in Europe and the advisory companies in Latin America, for example, and they're regulated in Malaysia, in reality, it's incredibly hard, almost impossible to claim against them. Which kind of brings me to another point, and that's that, do you know anyone who has been helped by financial regulation, especially across borders? Do you even know anyone who knows anyone who has been helped by financial regulation across borders? In 99.9% of cases, the answer is absolutely no. So often people will come out with these ridiculous things like saying, oh, well-regulated solutions and compliance and all this absolute BS, absolute nonsense. But then you ask people, okay, well, have you been helped by things like this? And usually the answer is absolutely no. And another point I would also make is it's quite a paternalistic approach to say that only high net worth individuals should get access to different asset classes. So, for example, in many countries around the world, the UK is an example of this, where I'm originally from, but many countries have a similar system. High net worth individuals and sophisticated investors are actually allowed to go into unregulated assets, but normal retail investors aren't. And you might say that's fair enough. And indeed, my organization, usually we don't, deal with retail investors. But the point is, if you're a retail investor, I go back to my first point. If you want to deal with, for example, an unregulated advisor who is offering Bitcoin, that should be your prerogative. That should be your choice. It's called markets. It's called capitalism. It's called competition. So a lot of this, pro-regulation stuff, it is anti-capitalist. It's anti-competition, because let's put it in a different way. What happens when many companies get regulated? What happens is, think about it. What do the regulators want? They don't want all these companies like this. They want fewer companies, because if you have fewer companies, there are fewer companies to actually oversee. So most regulators over time make the license more expensive, more difficult to get. And what that means is the big boys get bigger. So for example, what often happens is smaller companies can't get a license directly, so they need to go via a bigger company and rent the license like a network. So we've done that ourselves in several jurisdictions. So the point is, a lot of people, when they support financial regulation, they think they're helping the big, they're against the big boys, or they're helping the small guy. But in reality, they're often helping the big boys. Because think about it, like in the UK, for example, how many banks have been created in the last 100 years? Hardly any. Why? Getting a banking license is very expensive. In comparison, getting an electronic money institute kind of license like WISE is much easier. So there's been loads of competition in that space. So regulation restricts competition. That's the key point, right? If regulation gets too onerous, the big boys are actually helped in that situation. So, I'm not saying it's all bad, as I mentioned before. And from a purely selfish point of view, now I myself am going through the process in several countries of investing in licensed and regulated entities. From an investor's point of view, it's absolutely true that there's many good things about regulation because it restricts competition. So, from a purely selfish point of view, if I get a license in 2 or 3 months through an entity in one part of the world, and then a few months later, the regulators make it easier to get a license, obviously that goes against my own self-interest. So yes, from an investor's point of view, there's loads of good things about regulation and licensing because it restricts competition. So I'm actually particularly interested in getting licenses in places where it's actually hard to get licensing, because that's a good return on investment, usually, compared to a more open market. So I'm not even saying this from a self-interested point of view, right? Because probably it might even benefit me, being in some of those more highly regulated places, which is likely to be the case sometime this year and next year and beyond, because as mentioned, we are going through that process of getting those regulations, and I'm going to announce that soon on my website. But the point is, I'm even saying this as somebody who might benefit from the situation I'm describing. In reality, licensing and regulation does not help the small guy, including the small consumer, the small financial companies. It helps the big boys, the big banks. It helps big business and big government.